Um, I'm very glad those of you who have come, and if any of you have come from any other part of Bombay to Bandra and battled the traffic, then you would have known that it is an achievement to make it at this time in the evening on a Saturday to this part of the city. Um, I'm very glad that we are, however few are, that we are discussing these two very excellent books. Vidya's book, The Phantom Plague, and Radheshyam's book, Lives on the Edge. And I'm very glad that because I was asked to chair it, that I actually read both of them, which I had wanted to. I didn't know about Radheshyam's book, but of course I knew about Vidya's because it's had very good reviews. So I think, given that we've just been through this pandemic, which has touched all our lives, I think it's interesting to just think about what the pandemic meant, for us, and then think about it in relation to TB. For instance, I think one of the things we know that it brought out was this fear of disease, right? It brought that in stark reality to everybody, regardless of your class or place in society, that this was just something that you didn't know where it was and how it will affect you. So there was a lot of fear, and that fear led to people jumping to all kinds of conclusions, including who was responsible, as we know from those early days, apart from the Chinese. Here in India, we had the Tablighi Jamaat and the kind of stuff that went along about that. We also realized during these 2.5 years the importance of authenticated information. When you look back again at the last 2.5 years, the amount of fake information that was going around, and thanks to the world we live in now, where it's so easy to spread information, there were people who were just willing to believe whatever was forwarded to them, irrespective of trying to check whether, and including journalists, I'm afraid to say. We are all three journalists here, and the media, which actually perpetuated many of these wrong things that were going around. But it was based on this kind of fear, and also lack of actual genuine information, because people were struggling to understand what this pandemic was all about. The third thing I would say is what it exposed for all of us is the precarious state of healthcare in this country, and particularly public healthcare, and how important it is in a country like this with its inequities and poverty to have a public health system that serves the people who are the least able to pay. Whereas what happened this time was that those who were able to pay, of course, even they did not survive in some cases, but at least they were able to get somewhere. But there were people, as we know from all those pictures of the corpses in UP, who never even made it anywhere near healthcare. I think some of the other things that I was thinking was of the misdiagnosis, which happened also with COVID care. There was a lot of misdiagnosis. There was a lot of experimentation with the kind of drugs that were given, which led to further complications. And perhaps we don't even know how many people are paying the price for that right now. And then I think how global inequities, both in terms of where nations are in terms of the economic development, and the way the pharma sector works, which we'll see now when we talk about TB, how that also played out ultimately in the manner in which people could actually access medication or could not access it, who got medication, who did not, even when the vaccines were there, who got it, who did not, and so on. So I'm saying this because I think all of this, in a way, has already happened with TB, except that we are not aware. Just because we've had COVID, people have woken up at least to a few of these things. But this has been happening for more than a century, as Vidya's book really brings out all these stories. And I think the importance of us recognizing the silent killer that is amongst us even today, and in fact has perhaps become even more deadly than in those early years because of the fact of misdiagnosis, mistreatment. So we're at a stage now where there are people who have tuberculosis which can't be treated anymore because they become resistant to the drugs that earlier used to work on them. And this is not just happenstance, it's actually the way in which the healthcare system works. the indifference of governments, the lack of information, the lack of people being aware of what their rights are. Even when they're aware of what their rights, the difficulty of getting their, their rights for medication, for instance, as some of the stories we'll talk about today will bring out. So I think it's really important that all of us discuss this and understand it so that we see what happens in the future. I just want to draw your attention that just a week ago, here in the city in which we live, the Indian Express had this item, Suri TB Hospital has no pediatrician since 2020. Yeah, so this hospital in Suri, which is Asia's largest TB hospital, a 13-year-old child was taken there with lung TB, and they would not admit her because there was no pediatrician. To me, this is symptomatic of, the combination of the lack of healthcare, the neglect of healthcare, the inequity when a poor person has to turn to public health, the kind of situation they'll land up in, and where it has left us now. The WHO in your book, the figures that you give, Vidya, is that 1/4 of the world's population has latent TB. 1/4. Just think about it, what that means. Now, you were telling me earlier that we'll come to that there are now new figures. Radheshyam, you've said in your book that 1,200 people die a day from TB in India. 1,200 people a day. So, I mean, we are talking about something that is actually a really huge public health crisis that has been there all along, that has remained hidden from view, partly because of the kind of people it afflicts who cannot make a noise about it. And it's the fact that it's been neglected actually is something, as you have, I think, pointed out in your book in one of the sentences, which I thought was very strong, where you say ultimately we are all unintentionally responsible for the situation that has arisen, and how do we change it. So what I'd like to do is, we don't have much time, we have only an hour, but I'd like to divide it up into certain sections. And so first I thought, Vidya, perhaps you could give us some idea of this trajectory of TB over the last century, through maybe some anecdotes of, how it was discovered or not discovered or misdiscovered, and then how finally we've got to the place where it was identified as TB, and then we can go on to the question of treatment and so on.
Yeah, thank you for that question. TB has been with us almost as soon as we turned from nomadic people and became settlers, and because we were living in close proximity, and human beings have never evolved. We have not evolved to live in windowless houses. And when we started doing that, and we started doing that more and more, is when TB used it as a springboard. So the bacteria is found in Egyptian mummies, and it goes all the way back, and it's always moved with capital, so it spread through trade routes. And because it has such an ancient history, it has inspired great literature and great art and operatic tragedies and Moulin Rouge main characters, or many Russian literature, you will have protagonists dying of TB. And it has always been written off as a romantic malady. So, poets and writers have died of TB. And in all of that, it's unlike, again, we are now in an age where we have a novel coronavirus and an ancient TB. And it's such a stark comparison, because the bacteria is nothing like the virus. And they all have very individual traits, and they learn from human societies. So the bacteria is like slow and relentless, and it can like enter your body and stay dormant for decades in some cases if your immunity is well. And then in the 90s, what happened was the HIV epidemic basically I was in Suri reporting on the book when the medical superintendent who used very many war metaphors in his conversation, and he said that people talk about 9/11 and Bombay mein uske hisab ka kuch ho gaya and we just don't know. And he said if the first plane was HIV and the second plane was TB, because HIV virus does immunocompression, and the minute your immunity goes down, the bacteria goes from latent TB to active deadly killer. And so when the HIV epidemic happened in global health, there was a sudden realization that TB is dangerous. And by then, TB had learned to live because our attention was on HIV. The virus is a master, the bacteria is a master mutator, and it has learnt about us as much as we've learnt about it. And unlike other diseases like cancer or what TB, what infectious diseases do, is that it's impossible to talk about them without talking about race, caste, class, gender. His book does that very, very well. And we are now in a situation where all our attention was turned to COVID, and I know from my reporting that down to the TB helpline was turned to COVID. So we are coming out of 2 years of no attention to TB, and it's also an infectious respiratory disease. But from the gene expert to RT-PCR and all of these things that have become common language now, all of that was a part of TB program, which was cannibalized by COVID. And last week, WHO released the latest TB data, and it is alarming how bad things are. And Mumbai, in particular, if India has the most TB, and within India, Mumbai has the most TB, and within that, Mumbai also has the most drug-resistant TB. And as he was saying, 1,200 people die of TB every day in India. And at the peak of the HIV epidemic, 900 people were dying in South Africa of HIV. And we still remember the intergenerational scars, of what HIV did to Africa. But what we are seeing in Mumbai is, while I was reporting on this book, very, very few people knew about how dangerous the situation in Mumbai is. And once I started reporting, I was here for a couple of years, and I was here that Diwali and Eid. And people would come up to me and slowly say that my father-in-law has TB in the spine, this person has TB in the ankle. And there's so much stigma that we are living with it, and we are a city that doesn't talk about it, and we go into movie theaters which are poorly ventilated with very little information because the government at this point is not being very transparent. And all of that, and again, Mumbai has a real crisis of urban housing. And all of these, like TB is a symptom, poverty is the disease. I write it in the book. And that's where we are at with TB in India. I will let Radheshyam add to it.
But before that, it would be, just as we are still on the history, it would be very interesting to know this. By the way, Vidya's book, even if you're not interested in disease and health, it's very well written. Maybe because you're a journalist, because I find otherwise people get into this sort of academic type writing, and so is Radheshyam's book. And it can kill your interest in something that you thought you might be interested. So it's very engaging reading. But there's Sherlock Holmes appears in it. So I'm wondering whether you can give that incident, which I thought was quite entertaining in a very dark situation.
Yeah. Well, gallows humor is my brand.
Gallows humor. Yeah.
So because again, TB is an ancient disease, I start with how it influenced Dracula. But then also Arthur Conan Doyle was a science reporter before he wrote Sherlock Holmes, and he had a tanking private clinic. And he would go to his clinic and no patients would turn up. So he started writing Sherlock Holmes stories. But before that, he plays a cameo in 1892 when the bacteria was, Robert Koch identified the bacteria and for the first time gave a causal germ theory had just been established, and he basically said this bacteria causes this disease, and tuberculosis at that time was the world's greatest killer, and it to this day continues to be the leading infectious killer. And Sherlock Holmes lived in London at that point, and he took a train to Berlin, and he wanted to go see the patients Robert Koch had treated. And you could already see, I was just so fascinated that even before Sherlock Holmes came on paper in Arthur Conan Doyle, you see a prototype of Sherlock Holmes type activity where he went to Berlin, he heard Robert Koch's speech about, he's identified the disease, and he made this announcement that we have a remedy for TB, and it instantly made global news because it's like today coming out and announcing a cure for cancer or HIV, and immediately Robert Koch became a global star. And Arthur Conan Doyle was sitting in the audience, and he wrote a 6,000 word essay for, I think, the London Review, where he said that this doesn't make sense, and he used his deductive reasoning to say that what Robert Koch is calling a remedy is actually not, because antibiotic resistance, essentially, we now know from COVID that viruses, pathogens mutate, and medicines don't work on them all the time, and there is this law of diminishing returns. The more you use antibiotics, the less it affects you. And Arthur Conan Doyle plays this brilliant cameo where he goes up against the world's most famous scientist, and he does the job of a science reporter, and which to me was instructive and fascinating, and also such a good story. And he incidentally, I do write in my book that he became Sir Arthur Conan Doyle later, but he did not get knighthood for his literature. He got knighthood for writing a pamphlet about the British Army building concentration camps in South Africa during the Boer Wars, and he defended the British actions. That the knighthood had nothing to do with his literary achievements. And the book goes into these meandering stories, and Arthur Conan Doyle and Dracula figure in it, and Amitabh Bachchan briefly.
Yes. So, I mean, this is just to give you an idea of, the first part of the book does give you a sense of the history, but also with these anecdotes, in a sense, it weaves it all together. So it's not just dry history, but it's, it's peopled with interesting characters like Arthur Conan Doyle. I think your book, Radheshyam's book particularly, goes from this, the fact of TB being established and understood and some cures being come, but what is the situation today with people who are afflicted with it? And I think, I mean, many in this audience may already know that TB is not only affects the lungs, but it also can affect your bones, the spine, the stomach, your genitals, all kinds of places can be affected. Those may not be infectious, but they are still TB. And I think, Radheshyam, you've done a great job in the selection of the people you've spoken to and written about to bring this out. But also, as I said earlier, what I found really useful in your book is that it exposes for us how the inequalities that are there in our society, how they play out when, say, a woman goes and she's got genital TB. She will not talk about it. That woman you wrote about who had spinal TB, the transgender and the kind of problems they face. So maybe you can tell us a little about your journey of finding these people, and what is it that, as a reporter who writes on rural areas as well as on health, what is it that you've come away with from these stories?
Yeah. So I'm not a health reporter, I'm a rural reporter covering rural areas. Just we were discussing right now, we had a book released on Dr. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar wrote Annihilation of Caste, you might be knowing. And Kalpana was talking about fake news. Despite being a journalist, I'm saying this, I might lose my job saying this. There is a systematic annihilation of marginalized population in mass media. There are thousands and crores of people who are missing from the mainstream media. We don't know anything about these people and what is happening in their lives. Okay, just to give a figure, I just jotted down. And this is government's figure, government's data, which says National Family Health Survey 5, which is 2019-2021, recent one. about 64% deaths in Bihar are not registered, and 50% of deaths in Uttar Pradesh never come on record. So imagine what is happening in rural India. When I was covering drought in parts of Maharashtra and I was discussing with Kalpana, I came across a woman who was working with a self-help group, and she took me to a shop inauguration. Okay, and she said कि हमारे गांव में आज बहुत बड़ा दिन है, we are very happy. तो self-help group ने एक shop open किया है. What was it? So she said, and you might feel that what is this? It's really worth mentioning. So she said कि we have started a small shop where our girls can now buy sanitary napkins. Right? So it's a big thing. Asking for money from husband or father for sanitary napkin has repercussions in villages. Even today, we are living in 2022. So how this book came out was when I was covering this sugarcane cutter women. So actually they are dumped. There are 6 lakh sugarcane cutter women who work in Maharashtra, in Vidarbha and Marathwada region, and they come to Western Maharashtra for sugarcane cutting. So they actually dumped near sugar mill. They work day and night, and every day they lift or they have to take the bundle of 30-35 kgs of sugarcane on their head and take it to the trolley. During menstrual cycles, if they take a leave, now there are no sanitary napkins and nothing. Huh? If they take a leave or a break, they have to pay a fine of 500 rupees per day. Now, if something like tuberculosis happens here, she's not going to reveal it. Why? Because she's going to lose her job. And these are the 6 months where she with her husband works, and another 6 months they don't have. Maharashtra has 18% of irrigation, those so-called progressive state. There's no water, there's no farming, they work as laborers. So TB is something which comes as not only disease, but also something which they never want to reveal. So in one of my stories, I said that there was a girl who, a 10-month-old baby who had TB, and her father was saying, बाकी कुछ भी हो जाए इसका, और इसका शादी कैसे होगा? Right? So these are the stories about transgenders. These are the stories about sugarcane cutter women. These are the stories about abandoned women. These are the stories about people who are marginalized and they face graded discrimination because of their caste, creed, gender, race.
I thought that Sunanda's story,
Yeah.
Maybe you could just give at that.
So briefly, I'll explain you, and you should meet this woman. And she's a real heroine in my views, right? So when she was 15, her father was sugarcane cutter, and see what happens in Maharashtra. There are hundreds and thousands of girls, and it's on record again, who are married at the age of 13 and 14. And this number is huge in districts like Bid, in Marathwada region of Maharashtra. So this Sunanda's father was sugarcane cutter. At the age of 15, she was married off. And father said कि बहुत अच्छा लड़का है and settled family है, शादी कर दो. And when she got married, she came to her in-laws' house, and she was surprised because family was doing well and they had a small business of a kind. And she was surprised because why this man would marry a sugarcane cutter's daughter. One day, this man said, the husband said, okay, I'm not feeling well and थोड़े दिन काम नहीं करूँगा, I'll not work. And they had a baby by that time. The baby died in 9 days. Man was ill, sick all the time. He had HIV. Okay, and later he developed TB and he died. In-laws kicked her out of the house. saying, and what was the wording in Marathi? They said, ki, hey, Zadka Lakhod gyun kai karu? Means, what we'll do with this dead wood now? We have lost our gold. Yeah, and she was kicked out of the house. Her brother spit on her face saying, ki, tumko HIV or TB hua hai, don't come to us. And then she had to fight a battle, legal battle for her rights. In all these things, government machinery, where she went to treat for tuberculosis, said कि इसका कुछ इलाज विलाज नहीं होता है, निकल जाओ यहाँ से. So where she is going to go? She's a brave woman. She's still fighting. She's fighting all her battles. And one thing she told me, and many of these women told me, was that you have to fight your battles on your own. And that's really empowerment. Nobody is going to come and empower you. You have to fight your own battles. So they're fighting at every level. So when I say graded discrimination as a woman from backward class community, and woman who is having tuberculosis. So oppression, discrimination comes at multi-layers.
Thank you for that, because I mean, that story for me really illustrated, exactly what I'm saying about the many layers in our society and the way they play out in the lives of women, and especially both gender and caste. Which brings us to this point where, when, first of all, the diagnosis doesn't take place in India. Many people have it and it's not diagnosed, or they are treated with something, and that builds up their resistance. So now we have the situation which you've written about, Vidya, in your book, and it's been reported somewhat in the media here, this thing of drug-resistant TB and MDR also. And it's frightening, but it's also indicative, I think, of the fact of the callousness of the medical profession also in many of these instances, and of government policy. And the combination has exacerbated the situation, because whereas an intervention, when they realized that this was happening, could have at least checked it to some extent, now it's become literally rampant, where you have people who know they have TB, but the existing drugs are not working, or if there are drugs available somewhere, they're not able to get it. So, Vidya, I mean, that story of Shreya's is like heartbreaking that you've got in your book, which in a way brings out all these things, in addition to the government's policy and the policy of these large pharma companies of releasing effective drugs, or rather in holding back the use of effective drugs for what seemed completely nonsensical reasons, when there are people actually dying for them. So maybe you could share the Shreya's story.
Yeah, I was reporting for The Hindu when Shreya's father took the government to court, and he had spent his entire life... Shreya's father had spent his entire life working for the government, and his teenage daughter from Bihar got drug-resistant TB. In Patna, they were like shuttled around from private to private, private clinic to private clinic, being misdiagnosed. And that is a different problem with TB. What TB exists, in most countries there is audit of the kind of prescriptions, which in India we don't have. India is also the world's largest consumer of antibiotics. And a lot of people don't understand that antibiotics don't cure viral problems. So we keep popping pills, self-medicating for every small flu or something. And like in my family, I have relatives who have something small and they'd be like, "Maine augmentin le liya." Augmentin is a high-level antibiotic. And what then happens is you get, God forbid, an infection like TB. And that's what had happened to this kid. And her parents were like, she goes to school, how could she even contract it? Anyway, then they came to Delhi to diagnose, and it took her 4 years to find the correct doctor who diagnosed her correctly. By then, she was resistant to the most powerful known drugs in modern medicine. And then the Indian Health Ministry went to court, and India is the pharmacy of the world. And with COVID, we now know we shipped vaccines to different parts of the world. And to me, as a health reporter, it was very shocking that the government just bulldozed this teenage girl every step of the way, denying her a medicine which we make in Nagpur in a factory and ship it to UNICEF or Chai, which then they ship it to Geneva or Clinton Foundation, which then comes to Africa. And this twisted way of, shipping medicine, it's happening because there are new drugs that treat these drug-resistant TB, but they are tied in patent monopolies. And it was really shocking for me that this girl died of a disease that was curable, and then her family went back to Patna, and the landlord was like, आप हमारे घर में नहीं रह सकते because आपकी बेटी को टीबी है. वो मर गई टीबी से, बाकी किसी को टीबी नहीं है. The landlords evicted her. The younger sister had to change school because the school was like, आपकी बेटी can't come here because your family has TB. And the thing is, everybody has TB. There is so much TB in our society. We just don't talk about it and we stigmatize it. And it was very shocking for me that this family was so utterly destroyed when there were medicines. And the medicines are very affordable too, in India in particular, because we make them at a generic cost. And Shreya actually was the reason why I wrote the entire book, because it really shook my belief in, for all you say, I did not know that like a bunch of bureaucrats and the health ministry official will go out of their way to just deny this little kid. And then she died. And even as she died, she was interviewed by The Guardian, where she gave an interview saying, मेरे साथ तो हो गया, पर मेरे पीछे जो लाखों टीबी के मरीज हैं, उनके साथ ये नहीं होना चाहिए. And that is the reason I wrote it. I write about it in the book that when I wrote the book, I called Shreya's mother to ask for कि आप हमसे बात करेंगे कि नहीं, and she said, were you there when my daughter died? And I was like, I knew of it, I didn't call. And she was like, that's what you activists do, that's what you journalists do, that's what this government does. And her mother told me that I hope every doctor, their child gets TB and they all die. And I hope they all watch their children die with medicines. And the fact that we allow this to happen, and COVID second wave was all of that, because there was a lot of clutching of pearls saying, oh my God, how can this happen in Delhi? We are out of oxygen. But the thing is, we are entirely okay letting the poor people die. And then suddenly we have a disease where it hits us. Amitabh Bachchan got spinal TB when he was filming the first season of Kaun Banega Crorepati. And suddenly, no one is safe from infectious diseases. And, again, he was also talking about it. Infectious diseases don't know, don't respect caste or, class or gender. And this is our group destiny. We go to the same movie theaters, we hire the same cab drivers. And we are now at a point where this either has to be endured or addressed. And my book is an attempt to force that conversation, because apparently we can just be blind to a lot of things.
Yeah, but I think the other thing that you bring out, which is, of course, can become a whole new discussion and many books which have been written, is the whole thing of patents and the world organizations that decide on this, and how the pharma industry plays into this. And as you call it capitalism without competition. I thought this was a very good formulation, because basically that's what it is, because it's controls that are put in place for which the price is paid by mainly poor people, because again in your book you have a story of somebody who could afford, her father could afford to go to Japan and try and get a drug for her, But how many people can do that, of the kind who are afflicted with something like TB? They can't even, this 13-year-old child who came here to Bombay, she's from rural Maharashtra. And for her to come here would have cost as much as, in terms of proportionality, as much as for somebody to fly out of India, given how much they earn. And I think that's the whole thing about the pharma industry and the profits that go into treating. We've known it slightly with COVID, but I don't think the Indian press has written enough about it. And now, even when there are stories where we actually should investigate both the standards of the drugs that are produced, as well as the kind of pricing that takes place, those stories somehow are never written about. And the price of that is paid, I think you've also mentioned it in your book, the price is paid very much by the poor. So maybe, Radheshyam, would you have something to add to this? And then I'll ask Vidya also.
When you said price, I remembered something. So when I was traveling in tribal areas of Nashik in North Maharashtra, so there was one person sitting in the government hospital, okay, primary center, and he was insisting, doctor ko, ki his sister had TB, tuberculosis, and she was isolated. Yeah, and this person was insisting कि मुझको TB कैसे होगा? मुझको भी होना चाहिए tuberculosis. And this is happening. I'm sitting there, and वो डॉक्टर को बोल रहा है कि tuberculosis कैसे होता है? How it happens? तो डॉक्टर बोल रहे हैं कि अरे why you are getting? बाहर आने के बाद he is saying कि government gives 500 rupees per month. कोविड का टाइम था, there's no nothing to eat at home. जो 500 रुपीज़ मिल रहे थे निक्षय पोषण आहार के स्कीम है. Imagine this 500 rupees he was looking as a livelihood resource.
Yeah.
Yeah. And second thing, when we are discussing about the hospitals, so again NFHS data, again I'm saying 72% hospital beds are in urban India. 72%. So imagine what is happening in rural areas. Yeah. So in Kogam, I came across a transgender person, and she went to the government hospital. And first thing, the person at the counter said, कि why government is spending money on you? आप लोगों के ऊपर क्यों, मतलब आप लोग जी के क्या करोगे?
मर जाओ.
Right? Imagine what would have happened to that person. So she didn't got treatment in government hospital. She had to knock doors of NGOs, बहुत effort करके, and then she had HIV, and she struggled with life. So government agencies, people, we need to change the approach and attitude towards the marginalized population. We are not even ready to recognize the existence. So they are not only absent from media, but also when government plans its policies, health policies, health ministry का budget आता है, जो allocation होता है, and rightly she was saying कि medicine, I live in Pune where serum is instituted. Yeah. So that is another story. And as Kalpana said, we as journalists need to explore this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I may just interrupt with TB in particular, but this is not a TB problem, it's an Indian government problem.
Yeah.
If you have TB and you're poor, you're undertreated.
Yeah.
Mar jao. If you have money, you are overtreated. If you have an insurance, they will milk your insurance till the last penny is dried. And there is, with this government in particular, there is this complete abdication of responsibility in public health. And public health, sometimes, we have this way of looking where private good, somehow we talk about trickle-down economics and how a billionaire, and this is a city of billionaires in this country, how it automatically means the society is healthy. Aap mein se, but individual growth doesn't translate to societal growth in every case, and public health is a perfect case of collective destiny. And I feel like we are increasingly at a time where with climate change and permafrost melting and old pathogens coming, melting into our drainage system, we are now at a time that, we have to realize that no one is safe until everyone else is, and this system where you can't be sick because you're poor, or you can't be poor because you're sick. This system doesn't work. And India, for the longest time, has had a very progressive policy, not for lower castes, but then if you're in bigger cities, HIV did not have this moral judgment. I, for my book, interviewed so many people who said that, मेरे को TB हो गया, मेरे in-laws ने वापस भेज दिया. Because there is another very wrong myth that TB है तो आप बच्चा नहीं कर, आप बांझ हो. That is another reason why they send back women. And all of these things, we we have the system that we eradicated polio by running after polio. We eradicated leprosy by running after leprosy. We are increasingly at a time where we have to strengthen our health system, where at one window, you go and you get screened for all respiratory diseases. You can't chase disease after disease to profit a private partner because the government has just abdicated that job. And public health is my business with my government without like a a private hospital coming in the middle. And we are now at a point where I'm glad we are having this conversation. I remain optimistic.
Good. So actually, that's what I wanted to ask, because, I mean, all of you who are really interested must read both these books, because to get the background, we don't have the time to, for instance, the whole trips and patents, which is a very big issue on any disease, but particularly on TB, is something that you have to get your head around to understand. But I think let's look ahead a little bit, because given that we've just not completely come out of the pandemic, but we've had the pandemic experience, in a way you've touched on it. And Radheshyam, I want you also to come in. How do you see the future? I mean, do you feel that as a result of these lessons that we talked about, that there will be now at least a pressure to strengthen the public health system so that it reaches out? I mean, what is your own feeling as a person
just
who writes
briefly, when we're discussing about medicines, so one thing I realize or I feel is, when we are glorifying the past and traditions and traditional medicines and everything, it has serious repercussions on the ground.
Yeah.
So in Melghat area, there was a quack who was treating TB patients with traditional methods, and he was being glorified, saying कि हमारा बरसों से चला आ रहा है ये. So whatever government is saying now, whatever government is doing, it has different applications on the ground. Coming back to the health system, you asked, Kalpana, right? Yeah. So I think right from primary health center to district civil hospitals, this entire mechanism has broken down. So if you are not able to treat a person in private hospital, they will dump you in civil hospital. Go to any civil hospital in any district and you'll see thousands of patients just waiting to die without any treatment. So it needs a overall change in strategy, approach of the government, and also the way media is covering, the way media is writing. Not covering. So I think we need to have a comprehensive approach, more inclusive, I would say. And as I said, there are people who exist. We at least acknowledge their existence. We at least acknowledge that they have issues, and we need to address those issues when it comes to rural parts of India.
So, Vidya, I want to ask you, so because your research has also included examples from around the world, so have there been instances of, say, civil society or civil society with media or civil society with TB survivors who are also campaigning, which have actually impacted the manner in which governments and the health system in these countries responds to the crisis?
I mean, absolutely. So HIV movement is supposed to be the biggest it's a civil rights movement, and it was based on, the HIV crisis came a couple of decades right after the LGBTQ liberation. So they had these networks on which the HIV positive people could build their networks on. It did help that initially a lot of HIV patients were in LA and New York, and they were white gay men. They were men, they were white people, but then they were patients and they educated themselves. In Bombay, now I know that there are so many TB survivor activists who, exactly the way Shreya was saying, they just don't want this to befall on another family. And they have come together and they are helping each other out. But on a larger note, I actually do remain optimistic now, because for the first time, I've covered public health for 20 years in this country. And for the first time, I see people who are more aware of infectious diseases. There is more masking in general. But also, because of COVID, there is such a huge investment in RT-PCR, diagnostic tools, just testing and digital tools. And, all of these things, with the last 3 years, what we know is we have the tools to do it. We just need we just need the people. I was in the previous session where Geeta Ramaswamy was talking about revolutions, and in public health that is also true. The right to health is the 21st century's civil liberties fight, and increasingly with infectious diseases, black and brown populations die more. That just is true with COVID also. The vaccines are locked, and I was in the US where they are like 4 shots and booster shots, and Africa has not got like first shot of vaccine. And increasingly, I feel like we are getting to a point where people are being more vocal. There is more literature.
Yeah.
And media is a big problem, but then, there are small networks that are forming because of the pandemic. And the efforts of it, in fact, with TB, bedaquiline, which treats DRTB, the Mumbai Patent Office, Nandita Venkateshan, who had TB and went deaf in her ears, has gone to Mumbai Patent Office and challenged the Johnson & Johnson's patent on bedaquiline. And these are in Indian courts, and these are stories of inspiration. I remain hopeful for the same reasons that Geeta Ramaswamy said. We wake up every day, and if you lose hope, what is the point of getting out of bed, right? So
okay, I've got a prompt saying, please begin the question and answer. So Q&A, yeah, 10 minutes. So what I'd like, please
there's
ask,
a hand up there.
yeah,
at the back.
ask a question of any of the two speakers, identify yourself, and maybe we can do a couple of questions together, and then so that we can get in many more. So who would like to go first?
Hello, here I am, already here. I'm Poonam, and very depressing session. But just to share with you, my mate's son got TB, and he was admitted in the hospital at Sivri. Not a rupee she had to pay, just 100 rupees to enter the form in. And he's made total recovery, he's back to work. So it is just so nice that it is happening, it's not dead end. And she says the hospital is so good, the food is so good, the hospital is so clean. And they give fruits, they give eggs, they give everything. And not a rupee is charged. It's done by the government of India only, all said and done. And he came back hale and hearty. Of course, there's medicines yet going on, but he's back home and he's working.
Excellent, thank you for that. Any questions? Yeah, please. Tell us who you are and ask the question of any rank.
I am Dr. Pasquale Carvalho. I'm a microbiologist and an immunologist myself. And I would like to thank both the speakers for an excellent talk, for enlightening us about this, making such a lot of noise about this silent killer, actually, and also the chairperson who moderated this very well. And my question is very specific because you all are both journalists, and actually it's like fighting against a huge, corporation type of thing. So what exactly are the pressures, and I'm sure there are many of them, that you both face as journalists with the health authorities, regulatory authorities, who do their best to suppress this information? Because the facts that you put across, nobody likes to hear it in the big media. Or the people know about it, but everyone is silent about it. So you all are doing a tremendous job about this, but I'm sure you have pressures. So if you can share with us some of your experiences about that.
You go
You
first.
start.
What are the pressures? I will say that for a while, things are a little different now because with this government, things are tricky. And, we also have this mission mode attitude, like you give a target, like TB elimination targets are given. And these are not technical targets set by doctors or scientific people. These are political targets. And when you say things like India's private sector is actively feeding into the antibiotic, the crisis of drug-resistant TB comes from the private sector. Because as she correctly said, Sivri mein theek ilaj hota hai, agar mil jata hai to. There are conditions that apply. It's the private sector that's feeding the problem. And that kind of reporting has been problematic, but then I will say that it's never, for me, like Shreya's case was my reason to, everything else that you see in the book is for me to be able to tell Shreya's story. And there were problems, there were many, many publications who did not want to publish it. So I ended up writing the book. it's not good news, but then I'm not in the business of telling good news. And I'm not in a newsroom, I'm a freelancer, and I have caste privilege, and I do write for American publications. So I funded my entire reporting by I report for Caravan, which has its own problems with the government. But because I write for international publications or Lancet, I do get a little bit more money to then channel that into my local reporting. That is how I do my reporting, and I personally don't see them as unovercomable problems, especially when you see a TB patient. My problems are nothing compared to what that family is going through. And TB is it's not a one-person disease. It destroys a family, then it destroys the community, then it destroys that city, and Mumbai is in that place. And when you look at it from that perspective, I will say my entire book, it's been a privilege to see the courage of people and be able to document it. And while I was writing my book, so many patients died who are in the book. They just, died, and the least I can do, I feel, is bear witness to it. And I don't think these are as big a problems as being diagnosed with TB.
You want me to answer? Okay, just I'll deviate from little bit deviation, I would say. I'm a working journalist. I earn my livelihood as a reporter. Okay. I would like to ask you, when we as masses consume communication, consider it as commodity. Okay. So if you go to the market, you want organic food, you want healthy stuff to eat, you want good hospitals. Why don't you ask for good content from media? Yeah, so, and most importantly, if I'm going to pay 5 rupees for 20-25 pages, the content I'm going to get is trash, because that entire economy is based on advertising.
Yeah.
And rightly she was saying ki there are pharma companies, there are construction companies who are going to come up with advertisements, and if you are ready to pay for a good content, there are good reporters who would like to bring these stories to you as consumers, as audience. So that is one major issue, I think. We want content at cheap cost, 5 rupees, 2 rupees, 3 rupees, yeah, whatever. Yeah. You are going to get that quality of content. That is one thing. And personally, I believe I'm harvesting hope in darkness. But I believe that still there is space in mainstream media for good stories. You can still do good stories, though you have to fight for that space. Smita is sitting here. She's writing great stories. So you can still find space. But as you said, there are pressures. And as long as we are able to protect that space, you are here. Otherwise, you become part of the, if I can use the word, propaganda machinery.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't look at these things, journalism as public good.
Sorry, Rinki.
I had a question. Where is the stigma coming from, social stigma, which is so deeply, profoundly attached to TV? I remember I had a maid who was an Adivasi girl, and she was diagnosed with TB, and I treated her at home. I felt no threat, no fear. I gave her the best treatment, and she got cured. Fortunately, it was in the early stages, but I'm very curious to know why this huge stigma.
With again, there are people who are far more specialized in this. My understanding is simply that infectious diseases, it's a with pandemic we saw with I was in the US briefly when the pandemic happened, and there was a lot of attack on Asians. And especially with new, like in the 80s and 90s when HIV virus was spreading, there was this whole bus stand pe khade hain, someone will prick you a needle, and then there were those kind of conspiracy theories. With infectious diseases, it does bring out our basest emotions to the fore, and what we don't understand, we fear. And in TB in particular, I report in Govandi. A lot of my India reporting in the book is based in Govandi, in the slums. And you know, even in that tightly packed thing, people were like, "हम mask पहनेंगे, तो लोगों को पता चलेगा कि मेरे को कुछ है, तो मैं mask नहीं पहनूंगा." And then TB spreads more. And you know, slums are really tough places to live without friends. And wearing a mask then means, you know, you have to separate yourself. And infectious diseases are not a medical problem. They are a social problem. And stigma is tied into it. And very deeply, like, it raises a very profound philosophical question almost that, you know, if you have cancer in India, I have friends who have cancer, and you'll have support groups, and someone will be like, "Can I bake you something, and what kind, can I come with you for your chemo?" And I've also had friends who have TB, and they're like, "Dur hat ke baat karo." And you know, this fear of mujhe na ho jaye, ye bimari chhune se phailti hai. There is so, and even when the truth is, only one kind of TB is infectious. Extrapulmonary TB is not infectious, and even so, there is crushing, pulverizing stigma, because I feel, this is entirely my theory, in when you have an infectious disease, which can be HIV or a TB or any of these things, including COVID, you see yourselves shorn of all illusions. That is what we could be. And that scares us to a point where we do anything to put that distance. And, you know, human beings just behave very badly when faced with pathogens.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'll have to wrap up, but I think the crucial thing, what comes out, is that communicable diseases like TB really hold up a mirror to our society. You know, they show in their Sandhya. One question, comment. Okay, quickly. Quickly. First of all, fantastic, both of you fantastic. You bring together, you know, the various aspects of tuberculosis, from, you know, starvation to patent law and stuff like that. I just wanted to respond to one question you had, which is there hope? And it's not a new hope. The hope actually comes from, I mean, there is a movement which goes back more than 22 years, which is called the People's Health Assembly. So it's Indian, it's international. It comes from Alma Ata. At the time of Alma Ata, Haftan Mahler, who was then the WHO director, was a person who supported primary health care. So from there, actually, there has been a movement which has been going up and down, calling for access to health care, access to health, which includes all the social determinants of health. So, I mean, there is hope. And it's not just more than, you know, one or two battles. It's a large battle out there. Thank you, Sandhya. I think that's very well put. And there is hope. And I think, as we've said, I think it's really incumbent. A number of us here are journalists. And, do we have time for? No. Why don't you ask them separately? So I'll just say in wrapping up that, you know, I think we have to hang on to hope. But I think we have to push for exactly this: primary healthcare, primary education. You know, these are the things that are important, whereas we are boasting about high specialty hospitals, we are boasting about, you know, being the pharma, the industry of the world, and all these kind of things, when the reality is that people are not getting. We're boasting about super specialty in education when children are not going to school. This is the reality in our country. And I think civil society, and I include media and concerned journalists as part of it, we have to, I mean, the hurdles are much bigger today than they were, but the opportunities are there because we have many ways in which we can spread the information, and we can coalesce, you know, and bring about coalitions. So I think we must work on the basis that this has to change and this must change, because ultimately it affects all of us. You know, as you have said, something like TB really shows that the survival of all of our society depends on the survival of that one person who has been afflicted. So thank you, both Vidya and Radheshyam. Thank you for these wonderful books that you've written. Please, everybody, pick them up and get them to sign it, and encourage other people to read it. Thank you.